means to be the guy behind the guy, Taplines listener? If not, you can probably figure it out. Like, the Wizard of Oz is the guy. The man behind the curtain that we're supposed to pay no attention to is the guy behind the guy. Or the Oz, in that case. You get the idea. Today, we're going to be talking about the guy behind the guys behind the entire American beer business. And we're going to have a lot of fun doing it. On this episode of Taplines, we're joined by the one and only Joe Thompson, the founder and president of Independent Beverage Group. You've probably never heard of that company before, but I guarantee you hundreds of beer distributors across the country have. Joe is a 5-decade drinks business veteran and one of the most prolific brokers of middle-tier mergers and acquisitions in the United States. He estimates he's worked on around 200 deals in 49 states between wholesalers, giving him a virtually unrivaled perspective on how the middle tier has consolidated over the years. Of course he knows how Coors Silver Network and Miller's Blue Network became Molson Coors Blue Silver Network. I mean, he was the guy behind the guys doing those transformative deals in the 80s and 90s. That's what I booked him to talk about, and we did, among many, many other things. You won't get this kind of modern beer history anywhere else, folks. It's Joe Thompson, it's the Blue Silver Network, it's pulling back the curtain on the middle tier's journeyman matchmaker, and it's all right here, right now, on Vine Pair's Taplines. All right, yes. Joe Thompson, welcome to the Taplines virtual studio, my man.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Joe, where are you joining us from?
Bluffton, South Carolina, which is right outside of Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. Yeah.
Sure. You're, I spent about 3.5, just under 4 years in Charleston, South Carolina. So I was living down that way.
100 miles from you. Yep.
Yeah, there you go. Right between, not too far between, I guess, almost halfway between Savannah and Charleston.
Well, we're about 50. Well, we're closer to Savannah than we are in Charleston, but yeah, it's in between the two. Yeah.
It's in between. Yeah. How long, where are you from, Joe, originally?
Well, I was actually born in Savannah, Georgia, and lived there for 12 years. And when I was 12, we moved to Savannah, Tennessee. Kind of an oddity. Yeah. My dad worked at a paper mill.
Yeah.
And he moved up there to get a promotion. And so I went to high school in Savannah, Tennessee. So I actually claim Savannah, Tennessee as being where I'm being from. And for people that don't know, it's right where Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee meet. There's a little, right at that little corner. That's where it is. Yep. So, yeah.
Are you, is that over by, I picked once upon a time when I was driving through there many years ago, I picked up the Natchez Trace coming out of Tennessee and down into Mississippi, but I'm not sure if that's around where you grew up or not.
Well, it's, 60, 70 miles from there, but yeah, I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Thereabouts.
Thereabouts. Yeah. It's on the Tennessee River.
Yeah.
If you're a Civil War buff, it's where Shiloh was fought. Actually, on the other side of the river, and Pickwick Dam, which is part of the TVA system. So kind of nice little corner, very small. Gosh, I think probably 15,000 people in the whole county, even today. So it's not a big place.
Well, I got us off on this tangent. We don't have necessarily Civil War buffs that are listening to this podcast, but we do have history buffs. We have modern American beer history buffs, Joe, and they're in for a real treat today because you're joining us to talk about a part of the beer industry, the American beer industry, that gets a lot less attention than it ought to, but is, I think, maybe the most fascinating part of the whole shebang, and it's something that you've told me before that you really love this part of the business. We're going to be talking about the middle tier today, Joe, and your experience in the middle tier, specifically in sort of one aspect of the middle tier. I think is something our listeners really just have never come across before. People understand here on Taplines what beer distributors are. Of course, we have an audience that's tapped in, no pun intended, enough to understand how the 3-tier system works. In general, we have a lot of brewers who interact with independent distributors, some red houses, some blue houses. But, this wasn't always the way it was. This landscape has changed pretty rapidly and relatively recently. And you were a big a big agent of that change. We're going to talk about all that, but before we get into the meat of the matter, I wonder, Joe, can you tell our listeners a little bit about how you first found yourself in the in and around the American beer and beverage industry?
Sure. Yeah, I was. Well, I went to school at the University of Tennessee.
Go Volunteers!
Yes, sir. Yep, and I actually played ball there.
Did you?
67 to 71. Yeah.
Come on,
played on
baseball
good
or football?
Football.
No
Football.
Kidding.
Yep, I did.
What position?
I was a wide receiver.
Yeah, that's the way to go.
Not now. I'd have to be a tight end now, but I was a wide receiver, and we didn't throw that much. But I was actually the leading receiver in 70 and 71.
No kidding.
But yeah, I didn't even figure out how old I am. But I actually started loading trucks in the Budweiser warehouse on nights and weekends after I was through with school, and I was doing a little coaching over there at Tennessee, and to make a little. I was married, and to make a little extra money, I was loading trucks, and from there, I quit coaching and went into full-time work with Tipton Distributing in Knoxville. And did several jobs there. And then after about 4 or 5 years, I was a driver salesman. So warehouse driver sales, mid-management, ultimately ran it until about 1980, I think. And the guy I worked for passed away. His daughter fired me immediately. So,
oh, boy.
Yeah, that was good. I was running the company and at a very young age. And so I left there and went to work for Coca-Cola, hauling on national accounts. Did that for 3 years, and I went to work for Coors out in Colorado. And so I've been in it on both the distributor side and the supplier side. And we did a lot. I think I was at Coors from like 83 to 87. Or maybe 81 to 87. And we did a lot of Coors expansion then.
Sure.
So I got to meet wholesalers from pretty much all over the country.
Was that when, this was right around the time when Coors would have been pushing east. Did they build Shenandoah at that point or not yet?
No, when I was there, they actually built Shenandoah, I think. Yeah, they opened Shenandoah. But yeah, they were expanding east. And so I wasn't responsible for that, but I was around that, so I knew a lot about that. And I did several things at Coors, and so learned quite a bit on the supplier side. And then in 1987, I started my own business and fooled around a while with just basic consulting, but I always had in the back of my mind that. One of the big things I learned at Coors at the time, it wasn't Molson Coors. We introduced Coors into Hawaii, and we had a brewery in Denver. Miller and Coors, who were our primary competitors, had breweries on the West Coast, in L.A. And
Miller and Anheuser-Busch had breweries on the West Coast.
And Miller Brewing Company at the time,
which was still Philip Morris back then.
Was still owned by Philip Morris.
So they got buckets of money.
Yeah, and they're $1 a case from a freight standpoint.
Yeah,
cheaper than we are because we got to ship it from Colorado to L.A. and then put it on a boat in L.A. and send it over to Hawaii.
Sure.
We came up with this ingenious way to work that we were going to set up a sales and marketing company, and we subbed out the warehousing and delivery of the product to a flour company.
Flour, like the baking product.
Yeah, because it has to be refrigerated.
And it's heavy, and it comes on crates. Sure.
And they have warehouses for it.
Sure.
And so the company that we appointed as our distributor would be the sales and marketing, and the flour company would deliver the product. And it didn't work, but it was an ingenious idea. There's various reasons why it didn't work. But mostly our distributor was taking all the money and doing other things with it. But
I hate it when they do that.
Yeah. And so we eventually sold it to Paradise Beverage, which was John Anderson, the Anderson family. They're very prominent. They were then. And but I learned that distributors that are under scale, in order to compete with bigger distributors, they had to consolidate. In other words, what I used to say in my speeches was 1 and 1 equals 3, as a way to explain that when you put in the same footprint, in other words, if you had a Miller distributor and a Coors distributor, when you put them together, they created a synergistic value that hopefully made them more competitive. So that's what we did.
So at that point, Joe, who had the biggest share in most markets? Was it all Anheuser-Busch at that point, or did Schlitz still have share in most markets?
Schlitz was still around. They didn't start declining really until like 76 or something. But they were declining. Pabst, Stroh, Falstaff, all of those guys were still around. Howman. But they were declining. Anheuser-Busch was just kicking everybody's ass. That's what it boiled down to. I mean, they were growing 3% a year with 3% price increases, and they were just taking share. And I don't know, probably in the early 80s, I don't know what they were, probably 30, 35 share, but they were approaching 50 by the time things changed. So in order to compete, you had to put together the other guys to compete at the service level.
Sure. For the benefit of our listeners who may not understand with the level of granularity that you do, or even maybe with the level of granularity that I do, covering the space, when we talk about why 1 + 1, or when you say 1 + 1 equals 3, and when you say that share is so important for those Anheuser-Busch distributors that were getting out there and kicking ass, can you describe a little bit about, like what that actually looks like on the ground in the markets? Like how are those distributors leveraging that share to win out against their competitors? How was that playing out in the market at that point?
Anheuser-Busch at the time, from a distribution system standpoint, they were relative. You got to remember, you're coming out of a period where when Coors expanded in their early expansion, we went exclusive. In other words, we brought people in from outside. They had to be contractually had to handle nothing but Coors. Had to refrigerate it and had to go to every account every week.
Oh, the refrigeration. That's right. Bill and Joe were emphatic about refrigeration, maniacal about it, right?
It was not pasteurized. The beer was not pasteurized.
So it had to be refrigerated trucks and refrigerated warehouses all the way.
Right. That's right.
Cost a lot of money.
Cost a lot of money, and we'd go into a market. We'd have a distributor that had a 10 share competing against 2 other distributors that maybe had 40 and 30 or 40 and 40 or but there were 4 or 5 distributors. When I was in Knoxville, there were 5 distributors in the market. There was an AB distributor that I worked for. There was a Schlitz distributor. There was a Miller Country Club distributor. There was a Pabst distributor, and there was a Stroh Falstaff distributor. AB was the only one that was really growing every year. The others kind of bounced around and stuff and would eventually start buying each other. But from a distribution level standpoint, the Budweiser guys would have a truck that could go there 2 days a week with pre-sales people, with merchandisers, and the smaller share guys didn't have enough money to do that. We just couldn't compete from a service level, from a sales and marketing level, just basically on any level.
But the brand, like the Coors brand at that point, was very strong, if I'm not mistaken, right? I mean, like the Budweiser brand was also quite strong, but Coors had a strong brand in its flagship product, right?
They had a strong brand in the 13 original states. At one time, they had a 70 share in California.
Wow.
To give you an example. Okay. But they were losing share. But they went through a period of where they were non-union. So, and particularly in Cesar Chavez was boycotting Coors.
Yeah, and they got the Teamsters involved at one point too, didn't
Well,
they, up in San Francisco?
The unions were boycotting Coors.
Yeah.
And then the African American community was boycotting Coors because of something Bill said that was really innocuous, but it got blown out of. But we were dealing with a lot of boycotts. But we'd go in, they'd get a high share, and then they'd lose it pretty quick. And so, Coors early on decided to start going with existing distributors in the market as opposed to starting from scratch. And that helped.
Yeah, I bet. And I mean, you've got because beer distribute, a lot of people who don't understand the space or aren't, as familiar with it, maybe think that, oh, this is just anyone can run trucks, anyone can deliver this stuff. I mean, there's a fair amount of sophistication that goes into this stuff. I'm not a guy who thinks, like, oh, beer distributors, anyone can do it. I think there's some real logistical might that goes into it. So obviously people or firms that have done it before are going to have a higher success rate than folks who are coming in blind. I read I think it was like the Texas Tribune or the Texas Monthly did a story back in like 77, 70. So it would have been like right before your time at Coors, but Coors was pushing into the Texas market, and they did basically an open call for, hey, who wants a Coors distributorship?
Yeah.
And they got 2,000 applications. They got former astronauts, they got former MLB players, they got every sort of mid-major businessman in every market in the Lone Star State. And you can just kind of, extrapolate like, oh, well, some of these guys don't have any idea how to do a beer distribution.
That's true. That's true.
That might not work as well.
Yeah. And you got to remember, Coors was learning too. I mean, they had to learn what would work and what wouldn't work. And their old ways of doing business wouldn't work. You just couldn't do it. They're a great company. Man, they were a great company then. They had no debt. Everything was owned. Famously, they didn't believe in debt. Everything was done right there. The bottles, the cans.
Well, they were tremendously innovative too with the package themselves. They had the pop top. They were the first ones to do aluminum cans at serious scale. They had the whole ceramics business that they wound up spinning off into its own very successful business on its own.
I think they're all engineers from Cornell, and
that's right.
I used to always say that Bill Coors would rather go down on the can line and try to figure out how to make it go a little bit faster than he would to look at the real neat commercials, But there were a lot of things that they went through, and to the family's credit, they were able to adjust. Like I think Mark Harmon, who was on NCIS, which is one of my favorite TV shows, he was the first individual to be in a Coors commercial,
like a front man. Yeah.
Because prior to that, all you could show was nature. And the water and
bubbling brook, the Rocky Mountain stream, that's right. And and I've read. I obviously didn't live through this. You did, but I've read some about Bill and Joe Coors and sort of jockeying with Pete Coors, who was the younger generation who was coming in like, we got to start marketing. We got to do advertisement. And Bill and Joe, it sounded like. You can speak to this better than I can. It sounded like, well, why? The beer sells itself, man. We've done it the same way the whole time.
That's true.
But things were changing. Things were
changing. That's right. Yeah. Between the boycott with Cesar Chavez, which really, really hurt Coors.
Yeah.
The other one you mentioned, not many people know about. Very few people know about. It was a can that you had two holes, a big hole and a little hole.
Yep.
And you'd have to punch your finger into it, and people would sometimes cut their finger going into the can. So you're trying to drink a Coors beer with blood on the top of the can. Yeah. So that hurt them a lot too.
But they were proud of it, right? That innovation.
They were trying to be, and they were environmentally very, very progressive, because people would pull the tabs off, throw them on the ground, and people would, it was a different era. But
that's a classic engineer's solution. Well, it's a better solution. We solved the problem. We're like, well, people fucking hate it, man.
That's right. That's exactly right. That was an engineer's solution. That's right. Yeah.
All right. So you spoke to the idea that, Anheuser in this era, sort of like we're in the early 80s. Anheuser-Busch is kicking ass. This is sort of prime time for August Busch III, who, really one of the defining, I think, executives of the 20th century American beer business, really turns Anheuser-Busch into this singular juggernaut. We talk about Schlitz giving up share. We've spoken about that on other episodes. For listeners who might be interested, go check out our episode with Maureen Ogle, historian, about that. But Joe, so you start to see, you got this hands-on experience trying to put together a distributorship, an innovative Coors approach to get your beer out to Hawaii, and to sort of figure out ways to. You learn at that moment that, like, okay, share really matters. Like, this is the 1 + 1 = 3 revelation, and you start to see around the bend a little bit on maybe what has to happen or what probably will happen in the beer industry, and specifically in the middle tier. I mean, you start to see, gosh, like, to compete with Anheuser-Busch, someone's going to have to team up with someone, right? Like, talk a little bit about when you started to notice, the opportunity there, started to realize, it dawned on you that, like, something's going to have to change in a big way in the middle tier if this is going to go.
Well, coming out of the era you were in, you got to keep in mind, Anheuser-Busch, they didn't go from a 25 share to a 50 share overnight.
No.
They progressively, every year, August the 3rd, who I thought was was dynamic. He was clearly, in my lifetime, the leader of the best person for the beer industry that I personally think.
Yeah. But
so what would happen is maybe the Schlitz guy and the Pabst guy would get together, or maybe the Stroh guy would hook up with the Falstaff guy. You'd go from 5 distributors in a market to 4. So you could kind of see it coming in the early, through the 80s. AB was progressively getting better, and consolidation was beginning to start, but there was nobody out there facilitating it.
And it was all just one market for another. Yeah. They would happen to see each other and talk about it, and maybe it happens.
Yeah, they'd be competitors. One be losing money. And back then, there wasn't any process in place. One guy would basically buy you inventory, and the way they valued it, they'd pay you $3 a case. For whatever you say, they'd just give you $3 and plus buy you inventory. And that was it.
Yeah.
Did
the suppliers care that much at that for those type of deals, those little onesie-twosie deals?
Not really. They were pretty good about it. Miller didn't want to be, even then, back then, you probably could have, AB was not exclusive. That came later. But they were doing okay. They didn't need to buy anybody. Everybody else kind of needed to get together. And the suppliers were struggling themselves. Keep in mind that if a Schlitz distributor was struggling, it was because their supplier, Schlitz Brewing, was struggling. So kind of happening at both the same level.
Gotcha.
And really didn't take off. The first transaction I did was actually in 1980, I think 88.
Okay.
And it was the Schlitz guy selling to the Pabst guy. Okay. They were in Knoxville. They were both my friends. And so I did that job, and it was very, very small, very easy to do. And started to help facilitate the transaction. And things that came up were people that previous hadn't thought about. Okay, I knew the math. Not many other people did, to be very candid.
Because you've been on the job.
I'd learned it. Okay, I saw it. Like I say, I kind of saw around the corner a little bit. So the Pabst guy that could pay a little bit more because he wasn't going to need the warehouse. And he wasn't going to need, if he was running 10 trucks and the Schlitz guy was running 10 trucks, they could probably do it all on, say, 17 trucks. So you save 3 there. That's the synergistic value you get when you eliminate duplication. And by the way, retailers loved it because you had one less truck at their back door.
Sure.
And a back door back then at a supermarket was like a parking lot with beer and soft drink people, or DSD people.
Sure.
So it was kind of slow getting going, and we did a lot of that. I did my first deal was a Wrigley Beverage in Philadelphia.
No shit.
Yeah, that was the first one I really did, where we kind of put things together. That's a whole different story, but we were SAB or Miller Brewing Company was bought by SAB. And Miller became a pretty good competitor. The Miller was starting to, or Philip Morris bought them. That's who it was. Philip Morris bought them first.
Yeah, because SAB comes later. Yeah, that's
well,
right.
Philip Morris, if you'll remember, was big into advertising, on TV. And they really brought TV advertising to the equation. And Anheuser-Busch had to get into it in order to be competitive. And it was the great taste, less filling, and Budweiser.
The original light beer from Miller. Yeah,
that's right. And it was actually my theory on that. Coors actually, brand Coors, not Coors Light, brand Coors. What made it so, like when it was being bootlegged, people used to love it. They'd get 2 or 3 cases. You could drink a lot of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Because it had fewer calories than some of the. It was less filling.
It was a light beer before anyone talked about light beer. Yeah, sure.
But Philip Morris figured it out. And so you had Miller and AB fighting it out and everybody else struggling.
And Coors came along at, I think, 78 or so, right before you might have got there. They started talking about the silver bullet. They started putting together a prototype.
Probably,
Does that sound about right?
Yeah, it was there. They started to come around a little bit. They were late, but they started to come. I really didn't want to do it that much.
Of course, Anheuser-Busch was even later, but that doesn't matter because they were the big guys. So when they came in with Budweiser Light, which is what it was called for the first couple of years, right? Before they chopped it to just Bud Light. Yeah. That's when things really, the powder keg really exploded. What did the light beer wars do to the middle tier, to the folks that you were working with, obviously, these brands start going gangbusters, all this advertisement on TV, there's big pull in the marketplace. People start wanting these brands. That's good news for distributors maybe, but talk about how that reshaped the market from the middle tier from your point of view.
Well, the market, if you were a Miller distributor, you had Miller Lite, right? That was the first one, and they were out there first. They were advertising on TV. Bud was selling Bud and Busch, and Michelob. They had that then, but nobody else could. Those were the things that were taking off. They were growing leaps and bounds. And so if you didn't have Miller, which with Light or Bud, you were hurting.
You were in trouble. You couldn't walk. You call on an account and they say, "Where's your light beer?" I don't have.
Well, you got 2 people now where they used to just have Bud taking business from you. Now you got Bud and Light taking business from you. Yeah. So it kind of accelerated the consolidation at the supplier level and at the distributor level for a good period of time there.
Let's talk about the consolidation at the distributor level. So you do your first deal, or one of your first deals, in Knoxville between the Pabst and the Schlitz guys. Is that what you said?
Yeah,
the 2 distributors down there. Is that did you realize that could be a job at that point? Did it dawn on you that oh shit, there's going to be a lot more of these deals to do?
No, not really. Not really.
When did that happen? Yeah.
Well, it happened actually. I ended up getting a divorce, and I was a single parent. So I couldn't travel like I could, like I was doing. I left Coors in '87, and I was doing consulting, where you go in and you tell them how to cut costs and all that. I knew how to do all that. And, made a living doing it, but I couldn't travel when my son came to live with me. So early 90s, mid 90s is when I realized that I could make a living at it. Because the deals were big enough, and I got paid enough when I did it to where I didn't have to do a whole lot of deals. I ended up doing a lot because I really didn't have any competition. It was just me.
Yeah.
And a guy named Mike Mazzoni was doing Miller Brewing Company, but Mike was doing where Miller guys bought Miller guys. See, they didn't want Coors or
blue on blue. Yeah,
they didn't want Coors in there, so they were pretty adamant about it. I'd say early '90s, mid '90s, yeah.
How did these deals come up? I mean, this is before the internet really took off. No one has websites. Like, you're the guy, and people start to hear that you're the guy. Do distributors start calling you because they want to sell? Do distributors start calling you because they want to buy? What is the lead generation, to use the sales term, or the pipeline look like at that point? I mean, this is not something that everyone even understood was happening or could happen, right?
Yeah. Well, I've never advertised, ever. Never bought an ad.
Yeah.
My company was Independent Beverage Group, and I thought that through. So I could be independent, meaning I could work with anybody, any beer distributor or any supplier for that matter. But so I would speak at state conventions on the state of the industry, because to be real good at consolidation, you really got to know what the trends are on a global basis. And I would my deal to speak was any association, any state association that wanted me to speak, I would pay my own expenses, okay, and speak for 30 minutes. And I'd put together industry overviews and talk a little bit about consolidation, but not really oversell. And then, it was before Harry Schumacher had Beer Business Daily.
Sure, yeah.
Steinman.
Ben Steinman,
maybe be at one of the things where I was speaking, and he'd print it, okay, and say, here's what Joe Thompson said with Independent Beverage Group and talking about consolidation. So I used the state association meetings, number one, to get down. I knew a lot of the people, obviously. Sure. And use that, and the format from Beer Marketer's Insight was very helpful to me. And then Harry later was very helpful. All they did was just report what I said, and people picked up on it, and they'd call me, and I do about 80% selling beer distributorships,
representing
about 20,
the seller,
20 helping people buy.
Yeah,
I'm a much better salesman than I am helping a buyer.
Got it.
Much better.
And what was the demand in the marketplace at that time? Was it, I mean, again, we talked a little bit about where the suppliers are at, and we talked about what that meant for their distributors in respective markets, and the way that Anheuser-Busch's share gave them this big leg up. Coors and Miller, it became pretty clear, by the early 90s that mid-90s, that Stroh's wasn't going to make it. It was going to be Anheuser, Busch, Miller, Coors, top three, right? Like, that's when that started to solidify. Is that more or less right?
A little bit, yeah.
Schlitz was around. Couldn't, But Schlitz couldn't keep it together. They were having just so much trouble that it was not going to be a major player. If my history is correct, that sound about right to you?
You're correct. Yeah, you're correct.
So the distributors. So go ahead. No,
I was going to tell you about Schlitz. People don't realize. I was talking to Mike Mazzoni this morning on the phone, and we were talking about Reyes. I guess they're in Forbes 500, where they're worth billions of dollars.
They might be in Forbes. They might be in Forbes 50 at this point.
I don't know. I think they're
right up there.
They're doing well. But I was calling on Chip Comer in South Carolina, a wholesaler, just a friend of mine, and he told me that when Chris and Jude Reyes were in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is where they started
their first distributorship.
That's right. Yep. They actually had to borrow $10,000 from Chip's dad, Leon Comer, to buy a truckload of beer.
No kidding.
I later asked Chris Reyes if that was true, and he said it was absolutely the truth. And that was like
that's a lot of money back then.
That was a lot of money back then. Yep. And they paid him back. I did ask that. Chip said, "Yep, they paid him back with interest." But
you got to figure Chip would have rather kept a few shares of the privately held company.
The rest is history. On that.
Yeah, but keep the check,
But it was starting to the number of consolidations. The number was starting to pick up.
Yeah,
and I could do it was really before the craft boom.
Yep.
So I was primarily dealing with 5, 6 mate brewers. If you were doing a Miller deal and you got Miller approval, you were done. Now, if you do a Miller deal or a Molson Coors deal, you got to deal with 100 suppliers because all of them have to approve the transaction. Right. Because see, the thing that creates the value is the distribution rights. Mm-hmm. It's not the buildings and the trucks, but like in South Carolina, Tennessee, they have franchise laws.
Yep.
That when a beer distributor gets appointed, you basically have the distribution rights, the exclusive right to sell that brand in a defined footprint. Okay, for basically perpetuity. So that's a pretty good deal.
It's a pretty good deal. And Joe, you've described this to me before, and I think it's a great phrase to describe it. It's the double whammy. And the double whammy is you get exclusive distribution rights. And in many states, not all of them, but many states, there's also enfranchised in law, good cause, or the way it's phrased in each set of laws across 50 states or 47 states that have franchise laws, that you can't be terminated without good cause. This is very unusual in the broader world of commercial contract law. There's contracts between two private parties, but it's fairly rare, not unheard of, but fairly rare for the state's law to add additional parameters around the contract. And this is something that has been discussed and written about and litigated at length. I'm curious, leaving aside the moral judgment on it, and a lot of brewers hate it, and a lot of distributors think it's really important, and cats and dogs, and they can go at it till the end of time. But leaving aside any moral judgment on it, I want to, from the historical perspective, when does that start happening in your recollection? I mean, distributors started going to the state houses and lobbying more aggressively before they started consolidating. They even prior to consolidation in the middle tier, they had already, in many cases, won that franchise protection, right?
Yeah. Franchise for the states, you got to remember you got prohibition.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And you got the 21st Amendment, which gives each individual state the right to regulate alcohol.
Congress couldn't fucking figure it out. They were like, you know what, you guys deal with it.
Well, you got to remember, back then you wanted you're coming out of prohibition. The mob was in on prohibition.
Yep.
Okay, and they wanted to keep the mob out, and so decentralizing it was a good way to do it, and regulating it where you have to get a federal basic permit and a state permit. So the feds kept a little bit of control over it, and. But one of the big things is I can remember in the 70s when I was in Tennessee, one of the reasons we got franchise protection there, we had a contract, okay, but AB was changing the contract. His contracts were changing, was because if we lost Budweiser, we had a warehouse, we had trucks, we had personnel, we were out of business.
You're shit out of luck. You're just a guy with trucks at that point.
That's right. And so that was the argument, and that we need a little extra protection from this big monster in St. Louis, and got it. And most states did. I mean, I think all but 8, maybe fewer states than that have franchise protection. So it's good, and they're real good about collecting the tax. There's a lot of tax on beer, both at the federal level. The federal government taxes it at the supplier. The states tax it at the state level.
Yeah, got it.
And so they got this arm out there, this distribution arm that collects the tax for them and submits it to the state. So it's a pretty good deal for the states too.
Yeah, yeah. And I say that I just wanted to point out the timeline of the franchise laws because it maybe more so did the suppliers fought in many of the states, but they eventually kind of figured that it was going to happen, right? And mostly made peace with the idea. I mean, I went back and pulled in research for this episode. North Carolina was one of the first to go, I think like 1965, which predates even the period we're talking about. But it was a pretty nasty fight in Raleigh. There was actually, you may maybe know this because this was your neck of the woods. There were two beer bills that came up in the 1965 session in Raleigh, Joe. One was a price fixing proposition. They were going to cap the price, the per case price of beer or something. And the other was a franchise law bill, like this idea, good cause termination, whatever. A bunch of Schlitz distributors showed up. The first bill, was the first one to get heard, the price fixing bills. And the distributors did not like the sound of that, right? Distributors typically don't want to hear, or any part of the business doesn't want to hear that we're going to be limiting the amount that you can charge for beer, right? Whatever. That wasn't popular. So a bunch of them showed up in person in Raleigh for the hearing and really jawboned with the legislators. And the legislators got the message. That one died in committee. It didn't even go to a vote in 1965. When the franchise bill came up later that session, well, guess what? All those legislators remember all those Schlitz guys marching into the State House, and they said, "Boy, we better not mess with those guys." And the franchise bill passed.
That makes sense. Yeah.
I brought up the franchise protection just to point out that there was a tremendous amount of value that got tied up. I mean, beer distributors generated value by virtue of the labor that they performed for the suppliers, but when franchise protections came into play and were enshrined in state law in so many of the states, that added, a huge multiplier of the value. So then 20 years later, when these guys start to sell, that's a lot more than the values that it used to be for those little onesie-twosie deals that were happening that we talked about earlier, right? Like that, all of a sudden, these things are worth a lot of money, right?
Yep. They're worth a lot of money. Still are. They're worth a whole lot of money.
Even more now. Yeah. So, what was the typical arrangement? Obviously every deal is different, but there had to be certain suppliers, distributors that you were matching up more than others, right? I feel like you and I have talked before. Yeah. Miller and Coors, even though maybe early on Miller was not that into the idea, Miller and Coors made a complementary distribution match, right?
They eventually did.
Maybe not right away.
No, they didn't. They didn't really. They wanted to be exclusive, like AB was exclusive. And I struggled. Norman Adamy, who was one of the executives he's from South Africa. He was he publicly told people not to talk to me because didn't want. Oh yeah, he didn't want Coors going into his Miller houses. He didn't think you could sell two light beers in the same business, and so he publicly fought. They didn't like it, but there's states where suppliers can't unreasonably withhold approval, and so we were able to get a lot of those states done. And I wasn't real popular at Miller for a while, but over time we were able to work through it and get things done, and they began to see the value, the merit. Keep in mind, you had to get a lot of the Schlitz and Pabst and Stroh and Falstaff and everybody else on board, and Miller and Coors going together was kind of the last straw, last part of the equation. Not completely, but it was getting close.
Wait. Tell me a little bit more about that. Why was that the last straw? Because the other ones had already kind of consolidated up with one another.
Got it. Consolidated those. Mm-hmm. I've done over 200 deals in 49 states.
Distributor deals.
Distributor transactions.
So over 400 distributors, because there's a distributor on each side of the transaction.
On each side, Okay, so I've done that, taken a lot of cost out of the system with warehouses and trucks, and made very wealthy people of the buyers, quite frankly. But a lot of the transactions then, they were a lot easier than they are now. Because
interesting.
They were smaller, and I only had to deal with one or two suppliers. Yep. And, the buyer wouldn't want to take the building and didn't need the trucks. And so the seller would have to get rid of that kind of stuff. So, but it was a lot easier then. And so as the distributors got fewer, I was doing fewer deals, but bigger deals. and they were getting more complex, and we were kind of figuring it out as we go, and with no competition. So that really helped me.
Yeah, I bet. Sounds like a good gig.
I was like an exclusive beer distributor.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, you can't really buy better publicity than the executive of one company telling his independent distributors, "Hey, don't talk to Joe Thompson." Be like, well,
that's right.
They're going to pick up the phone and call Joe Thompson.
That's the first one. You're exactly right. Yeah, that helped. That helped. Yeah. Plus, you know people. I've always been one. I go visit people.
It's a small business.
Back then, I would go. If I spoke in Montana, I got to meet all the Montana distributors.
Yeah.
And then if one of them called me, early on, I'd have to drive, but drive to wherever they are and spend time with them and visit with them and get to know them. And over 40, 50 years of doing it, you just know everybody.
Sure.
That's what it boils down to.
Yeah. What does the share start to look like in a typical market once these Miller Coors tie-ups really start to take hold? I mean, we talked about Anheuser-Busch maybe coming close to 50 share in markets, and then Schlitz having whatever 20 and Miller having 15, whatever. But as we said, over the course of the late 80s and into the 90s, those suppliers, distributors in many markets start consolidating. They start buying one another. I mean, obviously every market is different, so the share is going to be different, from one city to the next. But like, what was a typical sort of share that you would see in an American city with once the consolidation of those distributors had really taken hold? What Anheuser-Busch do they hang on to 50 at that point, or do they start giving up share?
I don't think they ever got to 50 nationally. They may have gotten to 48 or 49, but I don't think they got to. But each state was different. If you were in the Southeast where they had a 70 share, you could put everybody together and only have 30. But over time, their exclusivity problem that was one of August's biggest mistakes, I think.
It's self-inflicted. Yeah.
So what you ended up with, the Miller guys, the Coors guys, as they were getting together, they were gaining share, getting more competitive, and Anheuser-Busch was losing a little bit of share, to where now you go to, I don't know, pick a state, and California. Okay, Reyes has most of California.
I was gonna say. California in particular is a tricky one. Yeah.
Well, AB at one time had a 70 share.
Sure.
Now, everybody but Anheuser-Busch, Reyes probably has a 60 share of volume and probably 65, maybe even 70% of gross profit.
Wow.
So it just completely inverted. I mean, the all other Constellation was a big part of it. The craft business. When all that stuff was taken off, the Budweiser guys couldn't get it they didn't get it because of the exclusive part of it.
So let's talk for people who don't know what you're referring to, Joe. Can you talk a little bit more about, because this is a major trend. Frank, we should probably do a whole episode just on this, but this is, if I'm not mistaken, you're referring to the 100% share of mind idea that August Busch III put forth. Can you explain that a little bit to listeners who maybe weren't around for that or haven't done the reading or whatever? What do you mean when you talk about that as a big, maybe Busch III's biggest mistake?
Well, it's just my opinion.
I know. But it's not. But you're not the only one who has pointed out that.
It's a topic of conversation in the
and
industry.
Objectively, it did not benefit.
It was a mistake.
Sure.
Basically, what they did, they wanted their wholesalers to only sell their products. So they came in and they put in an incentive program. They actually paid their distributors so much a case, pennies really, to maintain exclusive. And if you weren't exclusive, you couldn't buy your neighbor. They wouldn't approve you in another transaction, which was a big hook. And from a more subtle standpoint, you kind of knew that August didn't want you to do it, so you didn't do it. And so the Miller, Coors, all other guy just got everything. And everything turned in to be real important. And so the the Molson Coors guy, it was defined that way for a long time, got Constellation and Kraft and everything else. The AB guys were stuck with just AB. They were losing market share, and the other guys were growing, and the lines intersected. I can remember I spoke in New York to the Florida beer wholesalers. Now, what they were doing in New York, I have no idea.
Well, they must have seen a musical, you know?
There you go. Going to do something, going shopping with their wives or whatever. But one of the questions I got was what was one thing that if they did one thing right, what could they do to help their business? And my answer was, don't let the Miller and Coors guys consolidate. Okay? Because once they consolidate, they're going to be competitive.
Well, wait a second, Joe. Meanwhile, you were consolidating the Miller and Coors guys.
Absolutely. And the Bud guys. I did Bud deals. Yeah. I did Bud deals. I would deal with those guys all the time.
You'll take anyone's phone call. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But
absolutely. They were still do.
But tell me a little bit, because the Miller and Coors guys, obviously the distributors had incentive to double up. You've made the case over the course of this episode, of the course of this conversation, about why it made sense for Miller and Coors distributors to tie up. One would buy the other, or they would merge, or whatever the case may be. Anheuser-Busch guys didn't necessarily have that same incentive, but they also, as you said, the company started more or less putting the screws to them at a very bad moment or it would turn out to be a very bad moment in the trajectory of the U.S. beer industry, right? This is right as Kraft comes along. This is right as Corona starts making real big waves, right? And they're not, it's not that those Anheuser-Busch distributors couldn't go get those brands in terms of they could figure out how to cut a deal with, who was doing Corona back? Barton's? No. Who was
Barton, yeah. Mike Mazzoni and Bill Hackett had Barton's,
So they could line up. They knew how to onboard a brand, but they had already they were in lockstep with Anheuser-Busch, and it turned out to be quite to their detriment. I mean, they missed the boat the distributors missed the boat on a lot of what would turn out to be big, valuable brands.
Here's my view of the exclusive, and it obviously hurt the distributors.
Yeah.
Okay. But the one of the biggest things that I personally think, I don't know, I'm not that smart, but what it really did, it kept Anheuser-Busch from seeing the consumer shift. Okay. The consumer was changing. And because they were exclusive, they were very myopic in their vision. All they saw was their corner. You'd go to a national beer convention in Vegas, and all of the AB guys would be in one corner talking to themselves. Everybody else would be out trying to find out, get other brands, and there was a whole other world going on. And what was really going on was the consumer was changing taste, and they missed it. They didn't see it.
Wow.
So I thought that was not only the distributors suffered, but so did they.
Couldn't the distributors just say, hey, August, we get it, but we're not going to do that. That's not good for my business. I'm an independent business. Why didn't that happen, Joe?
Fear.
You didn't say
the fear. Okay. Everybody was afraid of August the 3rd. He was a very dominant personality.
Yeah.
And fear and respect, I guess. And I have all the respect for him in the world. But they were pretty tough. They were pretty tough until Maris. The Maris litigation stopped all that. Yeah.
Oh, that's I would love to touch on that in a moment. I just want to share a quick anecdote with you before. You probably have heard this story before, but for our listeners' benefit, I spoke with Peter Highmark, who's a third-generation distributor out in Southern California, the Coachella Valley. He runs Highmark Distributing. They just used to run Triangle as well, but they swapped. But anyway, Peter Highmark's been in the business forever, and he was describing to me in an interview the difference between when it was Anheuser-Busch under August Busch III and when it was Anheuser-Busch InBev under Carlos Brito. Obviously, enormous sea change, not just in the global beer business, but also in individual markets. Distributors who for 3 generations had dealt with the Busch family all of a sudden start dealing with, a totally different corporate culture brought in by the Brazilians. Anyway, he tells this story where he's like, boy, when August Busch came to town, or the third came to town, it would be, kind of felt like Game of Thrones, Peter said. He said, everything had to be ship shape, everything had to be clean. Those offices better look terrific and impressive, and I hope there's a golden eagle on the wall type of thing, and they never had that. So August Busch III was always, like a little maybe like, are you not, is the business not going well? Why do your offices not look that impressive? When Brito comes along after 2008, he sees, their modest offices in Indio, California, and he's like, good. You're not spending any money on unnecessary things. This isn't, I'm pleased,
Yeah, well, that's true. Peter's
big
right.
culture shift there between.
It was a huge culture shift.
Yeah. Let's talk about thank you for indulging me. I hope our listeners got a kick out. I certainly did. But let's talk about, you brought up the Maris litigation. And this was, again, another thing that we could do an entire episode on. But I feel like it ties in it would be a nice anecdote or moment in time to end this conversation on, because it kind of bookends some of the period that we were talking about. The Maris litigation takes place. We're talking about Roger Maris, by the way, listeners, famous baseball player. After he retires, he wants a beer distributorship, and not August Busch III, but Gussie says anyone who hits that many home runs should have an Anheuser-Busch
for the Cardinals. Yeah, for the Cardinals,
because that's where he finished out his career. Yeah. So, and the Busch family owned the St. Louis Cardinals at that time. Gussie more or less did that on his own. So anyway, they set him up with a beer distributorship in Florida. Things go well, but eventually they go south. Joe, what happens in the Maris litigation? Why was it such a big turning point in your mind?
Well, Roger passed away, so it was Rudy Maris. Okay, and Anheuser-Busch at the time was very tough, very hard, and they felt like Rudy was, the accusations go all along, but let me just say, they were unhappy with the way Rudy was running it. And tried
this is what,
like
mid-90s or so, I want to
say? Probably mid-90s. I can't even remember. I was actually an expert witness in the case, and I don't even remember when it was. But they felt like they had grounds to terminate, and they terminate, and Rudy fought. Prior to that, it wasn't worth fighting, to be honest. And Anheuser-Busch and AB, I think, was winning the case on the merits. But Rudy brought in a guy named Willie Gary, and he was an African-American lawyer who made it nothing but about emotions. Okay. And anyhow, long story short, AB lost.
It was a jury trial.
It was a jury trial, and Anheuser-Busch lost.
Yeah.
That's right.
Wow.
And they lost over $100 million.
It was a big setup. It was like $120 million in damages awarded.
That's right. Yeah, big money. And
what was the significance in the middle tier? What did that tell the middle tier, and what did it tell the suppliers?
Up until that point, no distributor had ever taken on a brewer and beat them.
Yeah.
So now all of a sudden, and Rudy Maris had spent $50 million trying to defend himself, but he won
years of his life. Years of his life,
but he won.
Yeah.
And so, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong on this, no beer distributor's business, the whole business, has been terminated since that point.
Wow.
Now, they terminate brands. One supplier will want to go somewhere else, and there'll be litigation over that and fair market value. But I can't think of anybody where it's gone all the way like that one.
And the supplier, even in Anheuser-Busch, even if they don't try to terminate, they have ways of making it clear, hey, we would like you to
have other ways of.
We would like you to find someone to sell it to, and we're going to suggest someone to sell it to. But they have never tried to do the nuclear option again, because they got burned so badly with Maris.
That's correct.
And that's where you start to see that franchise protection, because Florida is a franchise state with good cost, termination. That's where, listener, you start to see that value that we were talking about earlier in that conversation really accrue, and accrue to the middle tier specifically. Mm-hmm. And it's something that, Joe, you've done a lot of work in the trenches to actually go out and figure out what that value is and what it is in dollar numbers. Yeah. Joe, we've gone the distance here on Taplines. This has been a delightful romp through the relatively recent past of the middle tier. You're a man who's spent more time in beer distributorships, in more different beer distributorships than maybe anyone I've ever met, certainly anyone I've ever had on the podcast on Taplines. It's been a real treat for our listeners. What's one thing you'd like listeners to know about, sort of your your view of the middle tier. I mean, people don't necessarily understand this part of the business as much. It's behind the scenes. A lot of distributors are more private people, don't like the publicity. You've spent a lot of time with these people. What's one thing that you feel like gets lost in the conversation about the middle tier?
How important the beer distributors in that market are to the people in that market. They're most of them, they spend a lot of money in the community. They support a lot of different charities, and it's a very clean, efficient, national way of doing a product on a national basis. If you think about it, like I think say Molson Coors has 300 distributors across the country. Okay. They manage the warehouses. They clean the taps on the draft beer. They pull up the product on the shelf. If you can imagine how if Molson Coors tried to do that themselves, what a disaster it would be. It would be the difference between a federal government, how efficient the federal government is, opposed to how efficient the state governments are. And you can take it all the way down. If you took that down to a lower level, on a smaller level than that, how much more efficient you are when you have a family member owns a business, goes there every day, takes care of it, participates in the community. It's a very efficient way to do business, and very effective, very effective. Good people, honestly. I mean, they really do. The philanthropy, off the charts. People don't know that, but that's one thing.
You love the middle tier. It's obvious you've done a tremendous amount of work in the middle tier. And Joe, thanks for helping us pull back the curtain and talk about this side of the business that a lot of people just don't ever get a chance to see, and certainly don't get a chance to see up close and personal like you have for decades. Thanks so much for joining, Joe.
All right, appreciate it. Thanks. See you.
All right.
Bye.
Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sherino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes, you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.